Concerning the question, what is duty, Immanuel Kant, history's foremost deontologist, offers this definition: duty is the necessity of an act done out of respect for moral law. His basic argument leading up to this has two premises and a conclusion. The first premise is that an act is morally good if and only if it's done from goodwill. The second premise is an act is done from goodwill if and only if it is done from duty. Kant's conclusion then is an act is morally good if and only if it's done from duty. Note how Kant moves from premise 1 to premise 2. Goodwill, by definition, is the will to do what's good. The will to do what's good is the will to do what one ought. The will to do what one ought is the will to do one's duty. How do we distinguish between genuine duty and alleged but false duty? For one thing, moral law, according to Kant, is absolute. Otherwise, it wouldn't be law. We detect law by reason, and reason gives us law in imperatives or commands. There are two kinds of commands: hypothetical, categorical. For example, take the command, put sugar in it. That command by itself doesn't make sense. But if we complete the sentence by saying, if you want your coffee to taste sweet, put sugar in it, then that command makes sense. It makes sense only in certain conditions, and therefore it's hypothetical. A categorical imperative, on the other hand, is absolute. Don't lie. Don't steal. Don't commit adultery. All of those commands make perfectly good sense without putting them in any kind of specific context. Moral imperatives, says Kant, are absolute. So moral law comes to reason through categorical imperatives. The basic categorical imperative, and this is quite famous in the history of ethics, is that you should act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. The maxim in this case is the principle behind your act. Another version of this is treat rational beings always as ends in themselves and never merely as a means to some other end. Informally, we might shorten this to don't use people. For Kant, then, there are three possible ways to act relative to one's duty. You could act contrary to duty, which is clearly immoral. You could act according to duty, which is immoral since duty isn't your motive. Or you can act from duty, which is the only morally good option. Kant's own example is the example of a storekeeper who recognizes that it's a duty not to cheat his customers. If he does cheat a customer, then clearly he's acted contrary to duty. Suppose he treats a customer correctly, giving her the right change, for example, but he does it because he wants to avoid a lawsuit. In this case, he acted according to duty, but duty wasn't his motive, and therefore, says Kant, the storekeeper's act was still immoral. Only if the storekeeper acted because and only because it was his duty not to cheat the customer, then has he acted morally good. That seems to make morality pretty difficult.